This seems to be the time to start. This panel has a fascinating title, I would say, so I hope many people come to listen. We talk about 1 week after Trump, that's the title, and what does it mean for an open internet? I would read this title also not only about an open internet, but also an internet where people are protected and where our fundamental rights are protected. Our fundamental right to privacy, our fundamental right of freedom of speech, and also security, of course. The big question is, what happens in the United States? How does it affect us here, and how does it affect the world? It's difficult to say anything at the moment. The least we can say, when I switched on last Friday, I came home at 6, I switched on the television, I saw with quite some surprise some statements which at least would say had surprises in them. What I would like to do with this panel, with this significant panel, organized by ALDE, the political party, the liberals here in the European Parliament, to discuss a few issues. The panel will be moderated by Natalia Drozdiak, who is correspondent here for the Wall Street Journal here in Brussels. Next to her, we see Marina Kaljurand, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, and also former ambassador in the United States. Next to her, you know her all, Marietje Schaake, member of the European Parliament, dealing with trade, dealing with open internet and cybersecurity and a number of issues. So she knows a lot, of course. Next to her, we see Tim Maurer. Tim Maurer works for the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. and is a specialist, I would say, on cybersecurity, if I understand well, but he will tell that afterwards. And finally, we have Jennifer Granick, and Jennifer works for Stanford University. And at Stanford University, she deals with civil liberties. She's the director of civil liberties of the Stanford University. So much about the panel. What should we talk about in this difficult or this insecure time we are? When we talk about fundamental rights, that would be the perspective I would like to bring into this panel. I think there's a few things at stake. The first thing is the open internet. The internet, as we know it, with net neutrality is one of its basic issues. And there the question is, will this new administration safeguard the values of net neutrality of an open internet completely? Or will it see that what's happening, what our structure of internet is, that maybe too much government? Is there too much government in it? Is an idea of this administration that net neutrality, for instance, is something that should not be a role of government to ensure, but should be done without any guarantees from government. So the question is maybe a tendency towards less government. Another tendency we see is a tendency probably maybe about more government. When we talk about the dichotomy, the tension, the balance between privacy and security, one could ask ourselves whether or not in the next years this tendency, this balance might change towards possibly more security. Those are questions we don't know exactly, but possibly more security. So, and there government would like to do possibly more on the internet instead of less. The third question you could ask yourself is, what does it mean when a president says America first? What does this mean for our multilateral relations, our multilateral open internet? So that's the third question, which I would like to bring in. Yesterday, we already saw Jan-Philip Albrecht, member of parliament, tweeted a lot about it. We saw a presidential order which proclaimed that when applying privacy policies, US agencies should not give these rights to people who are not resident or not living or not nationals of the United States. So foreigners should get possibly less protection. And the other question is also related to it. How much do agreements we have, how much will they be respected? Do we say that pacta sunt servanda, we say as lawyers, is that still the case? So that's another element I would like to bring in. Of course, the EU-US Privacy Shield is something which springs to mind immediately. Will this EU-US Privacy Shield, which builds for a large part on commitments, on undertakings by the administration of the United States, the Obama administration, will that be respected? So those are a few elements we hopefully can discuss. The title of our panel, or the description of our panel, not only says that we should reflect, but we should also ask ourselves the question what Europe can and what Europe should do. I will give the floor now to Natalia, who will moderate.
Thanks so much, Hielke. I guess I'll just jump right in. I'm eager to hear from our panelists as well, and from their different perspectives, you know, what you see and how you think having Trump as our president might affect the open internet. And maybe we can start with Jennifer, picking up on this last point that Hielke mentioned with the Privacy Act that Trump signed in, and which says that that he is mandating the agencies to exclude non-Americans from the privacy policies. And that does raise questions over the Privacy Shield, although the way I understand it is it doesn't necessarily mean that it might affect it. So
I think that's right, but it raises a lot of questions, and you know, it's sort of the question is, what does it mean, as you asked, when you have a statement of intention that's at odds with what's necessary for data flows to take place? And the statement of intention from President Trump is that we're not going to extend Privacy Act rights to foreigners, and the statement of intention is America first, and you know, and other people secondarily. So legally, I think there's what does it mean, and the answer is there's a political answer, and then there's a legal answer, and I think the political answer is it looks really bad. Right? No question about it, looks really bad, especially at a time where, you know, the Privacy Shield is relatively new. There's an assessment scheduled for the summer to find out how well it's working. And then other agreements, like the umbrella agreement for law enforcement exchange of data, so police can share data, that depends on the Privacy Act protections being extended to Europeans in order for that to happen. Now, the executive order from a legal matter is really unclear whether it has any legal effect at all, because the text of the order says, you know, to the extent that it works with applicable law, we're not going to extend Privacy Act protections to foreigners. And there is a law, the Judicial Redress Act, that says that in the United States, do extend Privacy Act protections to citizens of other countries that extend similar protections back to us. So there's a statute there, and an executive order can't overturn a statute, so the law does say you have to go forward. So it may be that this executive order doesn't actually do much to the umbrella agreement, and maybe isn't super relevant to the Privacy Shield because there's this other statute. But I think there's a lot of other things that are going on in that Trump affects, that do affect Privacy Shield. So one thing is PPD 28, Presidential Policy Directive 28. It basically says that the U.S. isn't going to spy on Europeans for bad reasons, but it's okay for us to spy on Europeans for foreign intelligence reasons. So not a huge amount of protection there, but more than was there before. And Trump administration officials have said that they don't want to have PPD 28 anymore, they want to repeal it. So what happens if you can't trust that PPD 28 is going to exist, and you have the added problem in American surveillance law of not necessarily knowing whether the PPD 28 has been repealed or not, because it could be repealed in secret, and we would never know. So that's a serious problem. I think the second serious problem is the basic non-existence anymore of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. There are only 2 members still appointed to it. There's no quorum for it, and no sign that President Trump's going to appoint anybody to it anytime soon. We have the new rules about sharing information that the United States collects, either foreigners talking to each other or when the information is collected overseas, the so-called 12333 rules. There's lots more sharing of raw intelligence data among U.S. agencies now than there was before. And then the issue of the ombudsman, that's part of Privacy Shield, that's in the State Department. The top echelon of our State Department stepped down yesterday. So what does that mean for your ability to have faith in an ombudsman procedure? Never mind the problem that in order to have the procedure operate, Europeans have to know that their information was gathered, and that's top secret. Americans haven't been able to challenge surveillance under our law because we don't have standing, because we can't prove we were spied on. That's a big secret, who's spied on. How are Europeans going to avail themselves of the ombudsman procedure when you don't know if you've been a target? And then finally, I think the biggest issue is not that new. It's an outstanding issue, which is the policy or the statute that says that U.S. intelligence agencies can target foreigners overseas and collect information from inside the U.S., including from some of the most popular internet companies, so-called Section 702. And, proportionality is one of the fundamental aspects of Europeans' privacy rights, and yet you have this law that allows for targeting for any foreign intelligence purpose and no probable cause, no showing of criminal activity, not necessarily any connection to national security, no judicial review. So that law is actually going to be up for expiration at the end of 2017. And it is an opportunity for Europeans to affect one of the major ways that U.S. law fails to respect Europeans' privacy rights.
Great, thanks so much, Jennifer. Maybe we can switch over to Tim and hear from your perspective what concerns or potential cause for optimism there might be under Trump.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me today, and thank you all for coming today. I thought I'd start out with saying something positive first. Looking at the room and the black curtains and the black chairs, it resembles a little bit more than a funeral than what, when I accepted the invitation, I thought we might be speaking about. And I just thought I'd throw out there, we did something great last year. The year ended with the IANA transition being successful. And I think I just wanted to bring this back and start out with my remarks today, because I think it's a great example for how this community and the other communities who work on these issues over what was a very complicated issue that is transnational, that involved government and other stakeholders, pulled it off. And when I accepted the invitation, I thought we would be kind of like, still be in celebratory mode. And of course, that has not turned out to be what we're now talking about. Now, let me talk a little bit about what I think the effect of the election of President Trump will mean for the relationship between the US government and other countries that are not members of the European Union. And I think what we already know is human rights is not going to be very high on the agenda, and that part of the US foreign policy establishment that makes human rights a priority is not going to be a prominent part of this new administration. That's the obvious part. The less obvious part is, I think, that human rights are not going to be high on the agenda for foreign leaders and diplomats meeting with US officials either. And that is not necessarily just a function of this readjustment, but it's rather a function of the disruption in the foreign relations that we're already seeing just based on what we saw in the last 48 hours with regard to Mexico. And I think there's so much disruption in the bilateral relationships generally that when foreign government officials are meeting with the US government, that they will have to prioritize other issues that they might consider more important to defend in the first place, which contributes, I think, to this first trend that human rights are not going to be as high on the agenda as they are, which means for the human rights community, we're playing defense. So that would be the first thing that I want to say, and I think the Prime Minister May's comments regarding torture is a first sign of that, which has this interesting link to some of the intelligence sharing NSA, GCHQ debate. So that'd be point number one. The point number two, which I think the other trend that we're seeing for the coming years, is to bear in mind that this is not just a Trump US phenomenon, that we have the rise of populism in countries around the world, which I think will not only affect how human rights are being dealt with among governments, but also how NGOs, what their activities are going to be focused on, because I think there will be much more pressure to also focus just on the domestic human rights defense, which will absorb limited resources and might take away from the ability to cooperate internationally. which is in line with, I think, this trend toward more inward-looking, countries-first kind of approach. And the third one is, I think we might see new relations and alliances forming or strengthening as a result of that. We are starting to see this at the large scale, and it might affect, for example, nascent relationships between the German government and the Brazilian government that emerged in the last 3 years that didn't really exist as strongly before. So I think as a result of this general change, we might see some of this happening. And thus, just as a signpost, what might be early indicators of how the Trump administration views human rights, and I would point to Congress as a very important entity as well, because you obviously have Republicans who care deeply about human rights and also human rights online and have been very supportive of a lot of these efforts, and it's unclear right now what role they will play with the new administration. We don't have the political appointees at the assistant secretary level yet, or deputy assistant secretary, who are usually in charge of these policies. So the Freedom Online Coalition review process, I think, and how that will be structured and what kind of priorities will be associated with that, I think will be an early sign for how the new administration and especially the allies in Congress will think about the human rights agenda when it comes to digital rights moving forward.
Thanks, Tim. Now I'd like to move over to Marietje and hear from your perspective what you're seeing.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion with great panelists, and a lot has been said, so what I'm going to try to do is also start with something positive, although I really have to dig very deep in my mind and my heart at this moment. But as someone who's worked at the transatlantic relation since I left high school, basically, I'm a fundamental believer in that we have to give it new meaning anyway, and I guess it is now more than ever upon us, people who believe in the open society, open economies, the open internet and open minds, to actually take it into our own hands. Because we cannot rely on government-to-government relations to keep it solid and in defense of the very values that have bound us since World War II. But before we talk about the major challenge of the open internet under the Trump presidency, I wanted to emphasize how much it is related to some general points that Tim also made. I mean, we cannot talk about the open internet without talking about the fundamentals, such as fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms, respect for the rule of law, the American approach to its geopolitical and geostrategic role, whether it's going to be values-based or interest-based only, whether it will seek to be more of an aggressor or rather seek to strengthen an international law multilateral system, which it doesn't look like at this moment, with announced budget cuts to international organizations like the UN and other important organizations, and thereby weakening its commitment to international norms that these organizations advance. It will, of course, also impact the transatlantic relationship. And before we look at the specific role that this presidency might take, I do think that a lot of us have become a bit over-nostalgic over the Obama years in recent months, but just wanted to remind you that it has not been easy with Obama in office either. He had, contrary to President Trump, an extraordinary support or approval rate if Europeans would be able to vote for him. I believe 90% of Europeans were actually in favor of President Obama. And still, we had major differences of opinion, major political fights, ranging from the closing of Guantanamo, the use of drones, but also the practices by the National Security Agency that we learned about through the revelations of Edward Snowden. Whenever I came to Silicon Valley or to Washington, D.C., and we talked about topics like encryption, the general data protection regulation, net neutrality, fundamental rights, I was often attacked by companies, of course, because Europeans can only over-regulate and were intending to be protectionist with all these measures, but also by policymakers who were really trying to dismiss European efforts to legislate in the public interest and safeguarding fundamental rights first. We were accused of being oversensitive, etc., etc. And so I would be interested in learning whether you think that Silicon Valley has had a wake-up call, whether the notion, and I hope I say this correctly, if we build it, they will come, has landed there too. Because, of course, our concerns were with a strong and oversighted surveillance state per se, not only depending on whose hands the keys were in. And I think that that is very important to remember. So one key point that I will be looking at is how tech companies that are American are going to respond and are going to seek to build a relationship to this administration, whether they're going to actively stand for certain values or whether they're going to have an interest-based relationship and be quote-unquote pragmatic, as we've seen some of the CEOs doing. Similarly, I think the role of Republicans in Congress is going to be crucial, and we're going to have to seek, both on the European side and the American side, new alliances that may have to be broader and based on a few core priorities rather than us fighting amongst ourselves about the perfect world that we would like to see. It's been mentioned, the question is to what extent this administration will respect existing agreements. I think that that is crucial, but also which appointees will go to the Federal Trade Commission or Federal Communications Commission. That could in turn impact the way net neutrality is safeguarded in the US, and then if it would be eroded or less strictly regulated, then of course there could be people in Europe using this as an argument that we too may have to be less strict on the safeguarding of net neutrality for Europeans, because perhaps it could undermine our competitive advantage. So basically the erosion of norms in the US could lead to people seeking to erode those norms here. I believe the oversight of intelligence and surveillance in the US is going to be a crucial question. Similarly, the relationship between the presidency and other countries. In the context of hacking, accusations of the National Democratic Convention or Committee, I thought it was very remarkable that a president that claims to be patriotic chose to attack the president of his own country, sitting President Obama at the time, and side with Putin on his lack of retaliating sanctions when Obama did impose sanctions on Russians for this event of hacking. So it is a dramatic shift also internationally. And so I would like to end with some observations about the global impact, is that if the values-based claim, even if it was not always put into practice, but if the US steps away from seeking to be a values-based moral leader altogether, that will have major repercussions in terms of persuading other countries to respect fundamental rights, human rights, to respect international law, and our joint ability to seek ever higher standards instead of a lowering of standards. And I think this question of moral leadership also puts the spotlight on us in Europe. There has to be a recognition of the not only momentum but responsibility that we have in the European Union to really understand what is at stake, not only when it comes to our self-interest, questions of defense, questions of the transatlantic relationship, but also of the need for global leadership that is going to be based on values, and where people in countries under authoritarian leadership will know that they can still look to Europe. I think this is generally important, but particularly when it comes to the open internet and the rights of users that are related to that.
Thanks so much, Marietje. And I think that's one of the last points that you made is a perfect transition to Marina. You know, obviously there were some questions about the cyber hacking from Russia potentially having an impact on the democratic process in our country, and that's something that hacking from Russia that the Estonians know quite well and have to deal with on a frequent basis. So I'd like to hear from your perspective what you think on that.
Thank you, Natalia. Like others, I'm really happy and privileged to be in this panel, and many right things have been said. So I'll try to add a couple of my remarks, my ideas. Well, first of all, I'm a cybersecurity person. But what we see today is that cybersecurity and internet freedom, they are so intertwined that that you can't speak about one, not touching another. So one of the first statements, or one of the first principles I'd like to stress is that cyberspace, internet are not jungle without rules. There are rules. I'm a lawyer. I understand the importance of international law. At the same time, I've been a politician. I understand also the norms and rules that are not legal, but politically binding. And we are bound by rules online the same way as we are bound by rules offline. International law applies to cyber the same way as international law applies to our real life. The relations between US and Russia, yes, they have changed, but I would like to not concentrate so much on US-Russia. They are important countries, no question about that. But no global agreements can be made without attracting or having other countries on board, other superpowers, being it China, being it India, being it the EU. So if we want global solutions, and the internet is global, then we need global approach. Also, not only states and governments, but private sector, academia, civil society, non-state actors. Then we can be successful. As to the agreements, in practical terms, there is an agreement in force between the United States and Russia from 2013. And it's operational. Yes, it wasn't paid so much attention to after occupation of Crimea, bless you.
Sorry.
But now, not the pact, you. So, but now it's operational. And what do we see? Even if there is a legal document and there is no political will, the legal paper or the legal document doesn't matter. There has to be also political will. We might speculate, why didn't the agreement between Russia and US did not prevent from the hacking that happened during the presidential elections? I can give some ideas. First of all, I think that the pact does not pay attention to these small things that really don't kill anybody, that really don't destruct anything, and that really do not challenge peace and security. I think that from Russian side, they even didn't consider what happened when hacking the servers. It was more like a game, try to see how far can we go, can we influence other countries through ICT means, and so on and so on. So if it were a more important question, if it were to be, let's say, micro cyber 9/11, then the attitude of countries would have been completely different. Because what we see today, we haven't seen really cyber attacks that are causing real damage, real deaths, real destruction. You mentioned Estonia. Yes, in Estonia 2007, the cyber attacks were disturbing. Our people couldn't do online banking for a couple of days. Some websites were down, nobody died. So yes, it was humiliating for e-Estonia, and we're proud of being e-Estonia. Yes, it was disturbing, but it didn't destruct. So what I'm afraid of, or what I think that, I want countries globally, countries and other stakeholders, agree before even micro cyber 9/11 happens. We shouldn't wait. When we take parallel with nuclear, with money laundering, with chemical weapons, then usually we waited for a tragedy to happen, and then we started reacting. In cyber, we have an opportunity to do today. So what is the fora? The fora is United Nations, where governments meet. There is a United Nations group of governmental experts on cybersecurity discussing peaceful use of ICTs and working on international law, how it applies, and norms of responsible state behavior. But the things we can't solve offline, we can't solve online. If we don't have definition of terrorism, trust me, we will not agree on definition of cyber terrorism. If we do have questions about human rights offline, we will not be able to agree on human rights online. They're so intertwined, and again, political will. So in these these talks we're having in the United Nations, we have the same ideological battle about human rights, internet freedom, net neutrality, as we have in real life. And we see alliances being formed. Yes, we can talk about the alliance of Russia and China. I think that later I have an opportunity to answer to Tim's question whether bilaterally we will raise human rights, but I can say yes, we will. But okay, later I'll go into the details during maybe the later session. And finally, what I want to say, we shouldn't forget about developing countries, because they are crucial and they are the key. Today I have the feeling, also during the international discussions, that cybersecurity or internet freedom has become a topic for rich white countries. Yes, others are involved. We are politically correct. We invite geopolitically right countries, but their involvement, the involvement of developing countries, is not as serious and as good as it should be. There are different reasons, including capacities, but we have to pay attention to that. We have to convince them, the developing countries, that our model, where we see that the use of ICT develops the whole society. Mariette mentioned economy, human rights, policy, governance, culture, everything. That our way of living is beneficial for people, to attract them to our side, if I might say that way. Not to let them be under influence of those countries who see free internet as a disturbance, as a place for to calling for riots and protests against governments and so on. I'll stop here. I can speak for hours.
Well, I think we'll continue to get into a few more details in this next round of questions. So I'm kind of picking up two broad themes that are obviously interconnected, but the theme of human rights and privacy, and especially under Privacy Shield and other mechanisms like that, but then also combating terrorism online and cyber hacking. And so in this next round of questions, I'd be eager to ask the panelists, and also Hielke, if you have any views. I know you're an expert in some of these issues, so feel free to jump in. But more specifically, what should the EU do to fix or prevent some of these certain problems? Like, for example, with the Privacy Shield, I'd be curious to hear from Jennifer and maybe even Marietje, like, should the negotiators on the EU and the US side, should they not have had more foresight about having Donald Trump as the potential next president of the US and made an agreement that would have been truly robust in such a circumstance, for example?
I mean, my perspective is that the problem wasn't a lack of foresight. I can't fault other people for something I didn't see either. But I think that the problem is sort of a wishful thinking. And the wishful thinking is that we're going to kind of patch over the problems that the CJEU identified in Schrems and kind of brush it up with a little bit more process and hope that it works. But the ultimate fact is that under US law, Europeans do not get adequate privacy rights. And that is particularly true in the government surveillance context. Our law is explicit that Europeans can be spied on for any foreign intelligence reason. So the question is, what are Europeans going to do about that? And I mentioned that there's an opportunity because Section 702, which is the law that, that underlies the PRISM program that Edward Snowden revealed, it is going to expire in December of 2017. And Congress is going to be forced to make a decision about whether to continue it, to let it lapse, or to reform it. And this is an opportunity, a political opportunity for Europeans to change US law in a way that favors European privacy better. You can do that directly by pointing out that Privacy Shield can't survive Section 702, as many other groups have written and explained why. You can do it through economic pressure by going to US companies that have a voice with Congress and explain to them that as customers, the risk to Europeans is too great and you want them to stand up more than they have stood up and go to Congress and say, this is a problem that you actually need to fix. If there are things that you are dependent upon, just as advice, in order for Privacy Shield to stand up, don't get it in a secret agreement or in like written assurances, and don't get it in a presidential policy directive or executive order that can be secretly changed. Get it in public law that is enshrined in statute, if it's really that important. And I think that this is something that Europeans could really spend time on, and it would have a positive, beneficial effect. Now, obviously, there's other ways that Europeans are spied on, but I think that's a real opportunity. Just two other things I was thinking, Marina, when you were talking that we haven't talked that much about, and I just want to mention encryption and government hacking. So two things that are going on where, I'm not sure what the US policy is going to be on encryption, but it's an opportunity for Europeans who are concerned about security, not just for Europeans, but for people globally, to stand up and say that encryption is maybe the best defensive measure for cybersecurity that we have. And building backdoors into it is dangerous. The corollary to that is we need to start thinking about government hacking, which is often proposed as the alternative to encryption backdoors, although I don't see governments saying, okay, if you give us government hacking, we're not going to ask for backdoors. They're going to ask for both. But government hacking is something we're dealing with in the United States right now. We passed a rule change that technically doesn't say anything about foreigners, but pragmatically allows for computers in other countries where we don't know where the computer is to be hacked. And Europe is dealing with this same question about what the extent of European cross-border hacking will be in connection with the Cybercrime Convention. So this is an opportunity for moral leadership. It's an opportunity for legal leadership as well, to think about what does it mean when you have all these governments, national level, state level, local level, and their law enforcement agencies hacking computers to gather evidence. And what are we going to do about that? So I think that's a real opportunity as well.
Thanks so much. Did you want to go, Marietje? And then I think Hielke maybe afterwards. You said.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, my political party has already raised questions about how the redress would be implemented, and whether the insurances would be enough or whether the exemptions were too broad. So this is something that for us has always been a key issue, not only because of the election of Trump, but I do think that this different kind of leadership is a game changer for many. And I do believe that we must stand firm as the EU in what values and principles are non-negotiable. And we must also be aware of our leverage that we have, because there's mutual dependence. Yes, the US has a very strong tech sector, and therefore what happens under US law has a great impact globally. And basically American leadership has always had great impact globally. But we have to also be self-confident and clear about what it is we want to preserve in the EU. And I think in the field of encryption and not weakening it, there should be room for clear lines with the private sector. And I do believe that this is one of the key topics that should also be addressed. So I think that's a good one to bring up. Government hacking is another very, very troubling development, where in fact we see more and more governments seeking authority to do more of their own hacking, but they should be very much aware of the private market that they're also fueling with this, the tools that they're procuring to give them the ability to gain access or exfiltrate information from people's devices, which then will proliferate. And if we come back to the need for global norms, which I think is a key topic. Again, I would hope and urge for more European leadership in this moment, which is a game changer, but which we must also pick up as taking on much more responsibility than we have.
Thank you.
Let me pick up on this, not about the hacking, but I think in certain areas Europe has leverage, especially in privacy, data protection. The General Data Protection Regulation is, and we should use it internationally as a standard, as a high standard, which we could sell in the world, which we could defend in the wider world. And we see also that European privacy norms, for instance, are taken over in many jurisdictions at the moment, wide across the world. Not in the US, unfortunately, but in many other countries it does. So moral leadership, yes, and I think that's something which is really important for the EU. And we have some leverage as well, because we have a strong European Court of Justice, which in a number of cases has said clear things about the necessity of effective privacy and data protection. The European Court of Justice will not change its position. So in order to have trade around the world, this is leverage for the European Union. Also, American companies want to do trade, want to be active here on the European market. So they want to. There's an incentive for them to comply with our European higher standards. But we should indeed, and there I fully agree with everything Marietje said, stand firm on this.
On the question of cyber hacking, I think it was Biden at Davos. He had mentioned something about. He had warned the EU about how, you know, with elections here coming up this year, that there's a very high chance that countries here will face a similar prospect as the U.S. did during their elections, that they could potentially face hacking from Russia. And I'd be curious to hear from Marina and maybe also Tim, if you have any thoughts here, on what can the EU do to prevent a scenario like that, especially without aggravating Russia and creating more tensions with Russia?
Well, first of all, cybersecurity, it's an obligation of each and every state, each and every government to take care of cybersecurity. Full stop. And we are taking care of our cybersecurity not because of Russia, but because we want to continue our e-lifestyle. We want to continue with our internet voting that we've been doing since 2005 and other things. When Estonian people were asked after the elections in the United States were interfered, what do you think about our internet voting? Is it safe? Or if you think that there is something to be improved, will you still prefer to go to vote online or to return back to the traditional voting on paper? Majority answered, it's the responsibility of government to provide secure and safe internet services. We want to continue voting online. So here I appeal to governments. It's the responsibility of governments to provide secure exchange of data, to provide encryption, and to provide authentication of participants in the exchange of data. It's the responsibility of government. If I may, on a couple of other points that have been made so far. On EU, very right things have been said, what EU can do, but there are also other players. We shouldn't forget about, for example, I don't know, Council of Europe, Eurodic. We shouldn't forget about Freedom Online Coalition. There are several forums, and they do adopt right things, right policy papers, but then it stops. But it should continue to implementation, which means that we as states, private sector, academia, civil society, we can say out loudly, yes, we think these principles are right. Yes, we're going to follow these principles, even if we don't have a global agreement yet. Repeating the fact that international law applies to cyber, human rights offline equal to human rights online, we have to repeat it so long that we can convince everybody that's the right thing to do. Whether we're going to raise the question on our bilateral meeting, not that I know about a bilateral meeting with President Trump, but anyway, with his staff, yes, we will raise. And I think that coming from Estonia, we have moral right to do that. Look at the Freedom House report on internet freedom. 6 years in a row declining on internet freedom. I'm proud that my country is #1, together with Iceland. Okay, forget about Iceland. Estonia is #1. So we're proud of that, but it's an obligation. We have to be even more vocal on that point. And when talking to the United States, US is a natural ally to Europe. It's a fact. So we have to repeat how important is approach of the United States, how important is US voice, how important to be engaged in internet freedom, cybersecurity, and all those topics, because only together, as natural allies, we can be successful. And before you kill me, the final thing what I wanted to say, I will be looking with curiosity at what will happen to the countermeasures that were introduced by President Obama's administration. I can say that I waited for those countermeasures for a long time. I waited since November. okay, they were introduced late, but they were introduced. And that's the right thing to do. Yes, it had implications in Russia. So at least 35 diplomats had to pack their things and leave the country. But more important, it was international call. That will happen if you do that. Now it's up to President Trump to see whether he will continue, whether he will turn those sanctions back, because President Putin on that issue played very wisely. He even didn't enter into discussion with President Obama's administration. He even didn't answer. And for somebody coming from diplomatic circles, once your diplomats are expelled, it's the natural answer to expel the diplomats of another country. That's the diplomatic, it's tit for tat, it's a must. He didn't do it. He said that I don't deal with that administration. They're leaving. I'm looking at a new one. So it will be very interesting for me to see what President Trump will do on the countermeasures introduced during President Obama's administration.
And there's something really fascinating, I think, happening here. And Marina, you alluded to this earlier in terms of the connection between human rights and security. If you look at the major incidents that made front-page news in the United States and drove most of the discussions about national security when it comes to cybersecurity, there was a very strong link to the human rights dimension to it. So if you look at Sony, if you look at GitHub, and if you look at the DNZ hack, the Sony attack was because of the movie and content that was about to be released online, and it was a country taking issue with content that got the President of the United States for the first time ever in front of television cameras accusing another country. The GitHub attack that occurred 3 months later, that didn't make as many news, occurred because GitHub was hosting 2 web pages that were providing, one was providing anti-circumvention technologies to get around the Great Firewall, and the other was the Mandarin version of the New York Times. And that was one of the most aggressive actions that we've seen coming reportedly out of China. The DNZ hack is a hack and leak operation that, if you look at Russian doctrine dating back to the 1990s, fits perfectly into how they conceive of information security. So some of the most aggressive action we've seen from countries unfriendly to the United States have been through a very different prism of how these countries think about hacking and information security than most of the conversations in Washington to date about cybersecurity. I think there is a very big problem in terms of mirror imaging that is occurring within the national security community of we are projecting how we are thinking about hacking in a very military political context onto how others think about it, which I think is part of the reason why the agreement between the United States and Russia in 2013 didn't focus on these kind of effects. And the reason why that's important is, if you think about the Helsinki Accords from the 70s, we were negotiating different tracks. We were negotiating the first track on security separate from the third track on human rights. So you had different diplomats negotiating the 2 tracks which were independent of each other, so you were able to make deals and progress on these different tracks, which ultimately resulted in the Helsinki Accords, and depending on who you listen to, one basket was more important than the other. I think because of how some of these countries define information security and how they view it, we are now essentially in a situation where we're negotiating the first basket on security and the third basket on human rights in one, which creates all sorts of problem in terms of how we actually are making this rights-based argument and how the other countries are, what kind of deals they're willing to enter. And one, to your question about what the EU can do on what might be looming influence or information operations, I think, one, there's the advantage of having had the wake-up call from the US, which frankly shouldn't have been a wake-up call, because what we saw in Ukraine with the malware that was planted in the Presidential Election Commission, which was actually designed to manipulate the integrity of data and the outcome of the election data. And according to one Bloomberg article, 2 Russian media outlets the day of the election still reported the wrong numbers that were designed to be produced by the malware. It's not like there weren't other incidents. So what made the DNZ hack different was that it targeted the United States, the most powerful country in the world. And I don't think the countermeasures that were taken, frankly, were proportionate to what I think this represents for democratic systems. So European countries now have the advantage of being in a position to take measures before the elections are taking place. Parties are in a position that they can hopefully come to some sort of quiet gentleman's agreement not to exploit these kind of leaks, rather than waiting until something happens in the heat of everything. But one thing I wanted to pose to this group, and this will be my last comment on this, Jack Goldsmith, a law professor at the Harvard Law School, wrote a really interesting post a week ago. And Jack Goldsmith made a somewhat counterintuitive argument and proposed that the United States should cut a deal with Russia. His argument is, part of the reason the Russian government was conducting the DNZ Hague was because from Putin's perspective, the actions and steps taken by the US government regarding Ukraine and others were interfering in one, areas of influence from what they perceive as spheres of influence from the Russian perspective, but also the protests that occurred in Russia a couple of years ago and the commentary from Secretary Clinton at the time, he perceives to be meddling in internal affairs. Jack Goldsmith's argument is, we probably won't be able to come to any sort of agreement unless we start ourselves showing some restraint on some offensive cyber operations. And that if the US government is interested in coming to some sort of regime with other countries, that there is a very powerful argument to be made that you need to start by actually showing some restraint yourself on specific areas that are most important to you, which isn't limited just to the election hacking. But with regard specifically to the integrity of elections, he was suggesting that the Internet Freedom Program of the US government and the state-sponsored nature of it and funding of Internet Freedom programs to the State Department would be something where, if you imagine a political deal, you'd be willing to say, we won't do that in return for getting a commitment not to have an interfering in the integrity of elections of other countries. Now that's realpolitik, right? Like that's very Kissinger-like. But I just wanted to float this out in this room because it's a very different kind of narrative, and it was remarkable because Jack Goldsmith is the first person who's really made this argument since Dick Clark in 2011 in his book on cyber war made an argument that he had opposed the proposal by the Russians for cybersecurity in the late 90s and suggested in his 2011 book that the US government might want to rethink that position. Doesn't mean it's not my position, but I've noticed that it's bubbling up in certain discussions in the United States, and want to put that to the room as something to think about.
Great. Marianne, you said...
Just a two-finger remark, if I may, to Tim's remarks. Yes, it's good to have pacts. Yes, it's good to have agreements, but still never underestimate the role of your own government in providing cybersecurity. Government is responsible for elections, for open, free elections in the country, whether online, offline, whatever is most useful. As I said, we have had internet online elections since 2007. And yes, there has been lots of criticism that internet elections are not safe. But so far, nobody has argumented or given some proof that online elections are less secure than offline elections involving humans. So again, I'd like to stress, we might have agreements, and I'm working in the United Nations to have a global agreement, but each and every state has to do their part.
But can I also offer another, because this is a very crucial thing that Tim just brought up, because it may well be that the Trump administration is very happy to kill the whole Freedom Online coalition anyway, saves them funds, is in line with their other taking away of funding for international programs. And then if they can make it sound like a deal, it is actually all part of the same agenda, and it could suggest, at least to the Russians, who I believe, or sorry, let me rephrase, at least to the Kremlin, which I believe tends to look at the world in zero-sum terms, that they have won by creating some kind of moral equivalence between election hacking and funding NGOs. And I think that those are so different that we have to be careful there, aside from the notion that agreements with even adversaries is in principle important, if only because we have such a common interest in not creating a race to the bottom, and in being able, when we, Europeans, Americans, are no longer leading in, and who knows if we still are, but the assumption in the measures that American and European countries tend to take is that we are in a position to be, faster when it comes to hacking, faster and better when it comes to using drones, etc. While imagining the reverse, if other countries would be in a lead position to do the same. We would like there to be norms. So it's in a shared self-interest. It's not something other than a calculation of where the common interest lies. And I think that should also be a starting point that may well appeal to someone like President Trump, who I think has a tendency to think in terms of interests, not values, unfortunately.
I just want to say there's a fundamental technological problem with Goldsmith's proposal, which is the problem of attribution. So if you have rules and someone breaks the rules, then there needs to be a punishment. Otherwise, there's no disincentive to break the rules. And one of the things that's extremely hard in the cybersecurity context is how do you prove who the attacker is? And you can see that problem is true even now in the DNC hack. People are sure, but tying it back to the Kremlin is hard, and which agency did it and who was connected. So, unless we're better at attribution, these kinds of deals are really sort of pointless because the Russians will continue to do it without fear of reprisals.
That's a good point. Well, at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions, and I would say maybe the best thing would be to stand up, and I think you can use one of these microphones and identify yourself and pose your question. But maybe we'll give it a few more minutes.
No, we don't hear you. Sorry.
Microphone now.
Yes.
Baron Soko, Tech Freedom. I might be the only American in the room who's on the political right and yet is a consistent skeptic of government and will work to oppose this administration, as I have the last two administrations. But getting back to what can be done in the United States, you've talked a lot about the open internet and the concept of net neutrality. As I've mentioned on Twitter here during the discussion, this issue could have been resolved 10 years ago through legislation. The House has come close to resolving this issue by statute several times. The real issue has never really been net neutrality. It's always been the broad claims of legal authority that the FCC has made to regulate the internet. So right now, there has been on the table for 2 years a proposal from House and Senate Republicans to resolve the issue by codifying the open internet rules that have never been controversial, while restraining the FCC's broad grants of authority that have nothing to do with net neutrality, and yet Democrats have not taken that deal. And my fear is that they may have missed the boat, and that this issue now has become so polarized that both sides have taken positions on it that are frankly silly and simplistic, that we may not actually resolve this issue. And I haven't heard the panel actually talk about what you really want realistically. So I'd like to hear from you, in statute, what would you want so we can resolve this issue and move forward? And so that people in the civil liberties community who agree that we should be very concerned about what's going to happen can stop squabbling amongst themselves about what I think has become a fake issue. That's something that really could be resolved if people who just want to fight about it would just be realistic, practice a little bit of realpolitik, and come to the table about a legislative deal.
Someone want to?
Well, is it going to be easier in this Congress to make cross the aisle deals, or can the Republicans just fix this themselves?
That's why it should have happened 2 years
ago. No, I mean, but we
yes.
can't fix that. We can't go back in time.
And the reality is, all it takes is for a handful of Senate Democrats to be willing to negotiate, which they've previously been unwilling to do because President Obama decided that he was going to make this a way of reasserting his relevance, when, quite frankly, what he said had nothing to do with net neutrality. It was all pure showmanship. So yes, I think in some ways it is easier because he's not around anymore to stop moderate, sensible Democrats from recognizing that they can get 90+% of what they want in statute.
So if I can, one, I think your point is really interesting in terms of what, because you said that you identify with the right, and I think there is a big question right now what that means, given that with the Congress, the Trump administration, and how that will play out. So I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. I have not worked specifically on net neutrality, but was close to another team at my previous job of people did, and I think what you just outlined might have simplified a little bit of what I think some of the complexities of the issue were at the time. But what I think is really interesting, again, to your point about the importance of Congress, what we saw this week shouldn't have been really all that surprising. Every single president, the first week, wants to appeal to the base and will really make like the signature kind of executive orders that any president can do. President Obama did it. The previous presidents did it. So whatever we see coming out this week, yes, it's going to be a surprise, and people will be like, things he said are going to be implemented literally. But that's what the first week is all about. What I think will be more interesting will be to see the next 2 years, because I think what this administration might pursue is, if you look back at the Obama administration, there is a lot of political analysts will say that President Obama didn't use the first 2 years and the control in Congress that he enjoyed at the time as much as he could have, because he was focusing on trying to build a bipartisan kind of consensus, reaching across the aisle, and that the first 2 years of the Obama administration weren't as effective, and then after the first 2 years he lost the control on the Hill. Now with President Trump, similar situation, both houses of Congress are controlled by the Republican Party, and you might now have a lessons learned effect of, we don't want to waste the first 2 years, we don't know what's going to happen in 2 years, we're not going to focus on reaching across the aisle with the Democrats, apart from the Supreme Court discussions potentially, and that they will try to do a lot of legislative changes, and that will be a significant change from what we saw in the previous administration. This could include the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it could the whole 702 discussion, so I think that the next 2 years will be the really important period to watch. What's happening this first week, I think that is inevitable that every president does it. What will happen in the next 2 years, that will be the real game changer, I think.
Any other questions?
Yes, I'm Stuart Dresner from Privacy Laws and Business. I'm just thinking with President Trump, if he pulls the plugs, if he destroys the EU-US privacy shield, in a sense, he's achieving the same effect as Max Schrems was trying to achieve by taking on a case in the Court of Justice of the European Union. So you have a sort of unholy alliance between the civil rights people in Europe and the Republicans and President Trump in the States. But still, companies need to transfer data, personal data, across the Atlantic. So what does the panel think about how this will work in the future with this unexpected cancellation of the EU-US privacy shield?
I mean, I don't think that the privacy shield's been canceled yet. We still have the privacy shield, and there's a path. There's a long way between here and it going away. I think that the problem has been that there's been the discussion primarily between trade negotiators and not enough with human rights and the CJEU and the data protection authorities weighing in. And I think that conversation, and U.S. Congress, and how much we're going to value those data flows and the economic benefit from them. So I think that conversation is a conversation that we all have yet to have. And we're going to have that conversation. And what I've come here trying to do is to say, be very active in that conversation so that these other interests, not just the economic interests that are like, let's try to paper this over and make it work as smoothly as possible, but these other important, the privacy interests and the human rights interests, are predominant, because I think A, that's going to have more longevity, and B, I think it's just really fundamentally important from a values point of view in the first place.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Or?
I mean, pragmatically, I think that's a function of pushing companies forward and Europe making clear what the problems with Privacy Shield are. I know a lot of people have made clear, but I think those issues haven't been brought to the forefront and said, these are the things that need to change, and this is how it has to change in order for this to go forward.
Thanks, Jen. I guess we'll take one last question if anyone has any.
I think everyone's hungry.
Yeah.
If I may, just to wrap up, I mean, on Privacy Shield, does anyone on the panel actually expect that it will survive ECJ scrutiny? Because it seems to me that 702, much as I agree with Jennifer, is not going to be substantially reformed. The Judicial Redress Act includes a provision that actually gives the administration broad discretion to decide which countries are covered and to undo that designation. And I'm sorry to say that American courts defer to administrative agencies. And so that is going to go away. This is going to get much worse before it gets better. I find it difficult to understand how Privacy Shield will survive even on its own terms. And I agree with Jennifer, it wasn't originally responsive to what the ECJ said in Schrems anyway. So A, do you really think that Privacy Shield is going to survive? And B, if it doesn't, what happens, given this unholy alliance that this gentleman just mentioned? Do we end up with essentially a digital trade war?
I don't think it'll survive. I think that the reason why it's gotten so far to a large extent was based on a perception of good faith and honesty and likability on the part of the Obama administration. I think that likability has been entirely squandered. So given that you're dealing with a negotiating partner that you cannot trust on privacy, I don't see that people are going to feel really comfortable with Privacy Shield. As for what happens, I don't know. I agree with you. I think it's going to be a disaster.
I want to end on a positive note again and point out, I think there might actually also be in certain areas actually real opportunities to advance the agenda in certain areas, because I think there are also some interesting signs from, one, the Trump administration and President Trump has been remarkably silent / supportive of LGBT rights for a Republican candidate. You saw that at the convention. He has also tweeted about opposing the House's measure to actually get rid of the ethics office in the House and some of the lobbying pieces that he puts in place. So at this point, I think there is actually still an uncertainty of how certain things will shake out, and it'll come down to who he will nominate for certain positions. But in spite of what I agree with everybody here, it'll be we are playing defense. There might be actually areas where there might be opportunities to advance the agenda on certain specific issues, and it's just important to keep an eye out for those and to catalyze on those potential opportunities that might arise.
And on that note, please join me in thanking the panelists. It was really interesting hearing from all of you on these topics.